Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Misconceptions. I am really honored to have a colleague of mine that I met at a conference who is sometimes you have people who come up to you at a conference and they're like, I need to give you some feedback. And you're like, oh no, what did I say wrong? And Karen Sims came up to me and said, I want to share something with you. And it was done in the most like, I don't want to use the word respectful, but it was done in the most humble and like open. And I really want to help perspective that was like, yeah, tell me more. Let me learn more about this. So, welcome, Karen Sims. Thank you so much for being a part of our conversation.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm sure people know, but your wisdom, brilliance, excellence, it's hard to critique someone who comes with so much expertise. So, and also thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So, we are going to be talking about trauma, but we're going to kind of like narrow it in just a little bit about transgenerational trauma. And you are actually the founder of the Trauma and Resilience Initiative. So, I want to hear more about that. But before we get into that, tell me a little bit about who you are. What brought you to this work?
So the short answer is, the short answer is I probably have done some re work around trauma, didn't even know it was trauma because it didn't really have a language and framing for most of my professional career. Like many people who enter this work, I came with my own narrative. So it was my own sort of lived experience and a commitment to want to offer healing to individuals who've been impacted by adversity. So I started my career off in HIV and AIDS work. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, late 90s, which was important to note because it was a time where people didn't think women could contract HIV, and I was doing HIV AIDS work for women,
Mm.
but then got a chance to work with people from a variety of different sexual orientations and gender identities. And so it was a really profound experience. So that's kind of how I probably first got interested in this whole field. When I was doing that work, I realized the questions we were asking from my perspective weren't the right questions. And so I went and got my master's degree. And the short answer is I went to a conference. So I was a part of a project in Champaign, Illinois, and we got a federal system of care grant. And it was a SAMHSA grant designed to improve children's mental health services. And the beautiful thing about federal grants is they require a lot of training. And they were sort of rolling out because SAMHSA had identified trauma-informed care as one of its core priorities. And after Katrina and a bunch of different things. And so we were at a conference, they roll out this concept of trauma-informed care. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, every single value that they were talking about. So I was like, oh, we could talk about cultural competency. That's included in trauma-informed care. We could talk about client-centered engagement. That's trauma-informed care. And when I thought about every single evidence-based practice, it was sort of hitting the checklist. And I was like, why would I then offer 10 trainings on a bunch of different things or require people rather than just give them one centralized framework where if you acknowledge like how stress and adversity impacts the nervous system, what people need to heal, what people need to engage with you, then you're probably going to get it right. And so I just became so sold. And it was also something that tended to be broader than a lot of the mental health work that I had done before because people would think most mental health work was sort of subjective, like we were kind of making it up. And trauma-informed care, from my understanding of how the brain and neurobiology, like what it takes for people to get wounded and what it takes to heal, has a lot of evidence and science behind it. And sort of it converts the unconvertible to be like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, I can agree with that. So that's my long-winded way. of
So
describing how I came to the work. Yeah.
So when you talk about like how the brain experiences trauma from and I do want to get into understanding what the initiative like formally is, but I want to hear a little bit more of where do you feel we are today? I feel like there's a lot of, I'm going to call them newer because they're really not new, but newer trauma initiatives, like trauma recovery initiatives, or modalities. The brain spotting, the EMDR is a little bit older, the accelerated resolution therapy. And I just heard of some other acronyms that are popping up, and I'm kind of like, well, that sounds really interesting, but show me the data, right? Show me the evidence, show me how this works, show me why this works. And even in EMDR, and the EMDR, devotees will hate me for saying this, like the evidence is mixed, at least based on what I've heard. And so the evidence is mixed in terms of it being the only way to do things or the most effective way to do things. But let me hear from you a little bit about what do we understand today, end of 2025? What do we really understand about the neurobiology experience of trauma?
So it's a mix. And I will also offer that I think it's to me important to contextualize how we've come to learn about the brain and how it has influenced trauma. So, one, from my understanding, most of the work around the brain and trauma initially has come a lot from the VA. So, a lot of that work has come when we try to work with vets and trying to help people's brains heal from um, traumatic brain injury, and just a variety of different things that came from the war in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan. So, part
I think it
one.
probably, I just want to clarify, I think it preceded into
Oh, yeah.
Vietnam for sure. Like the World War
Yeah.
II, Vietnam, that was when we
Yeah.
started to finally understand. I
Like
feel like
PTSD.
the PTSD, like what does that actually look like? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Thank you.
And so, and then we added the concussion study that
Mm.
also gave us a lot of information about how the brain gets injured, how memory gets stored, what can heal. And then we have a lot of just really fancy developments with technology and PET scans and CAT scans and all of that. So you take all of the fancy technology, and we also realize that even in the best case scenario, we're all really individualized. So I want to just say how
Hmm.
the brain works and how it wires and fires and how it heals and how it gets wounded. And knowing that in spite of like all of the great research, people's individual nuances. So taking that, we understand that the brain is like a muscle and it has the ability to get injured in lots of different ways. It can get injured in early childhood development. So we know things like the amygdala. People think about the amygdala as the big, fight, flight, the brain's alarm. And we now know that it can change. And we also learned a lot of this through looking at adoptees, right? So we were looking at babies and attachment. So amygdala can get altered in development and early childhood development. And so we know like when the amygdala, which is when we think about trauma, a lot of the work is around the amygdala and nervous system responses. If it gets too big, it's sort of set like a bigger alarm response. And if it gets too small, it can be too small. It doesn't create enough activity.
Hmm.
And so people do more to do stimulation. We know how the a little bit around like where memories get stored and not stored. And we now understand that memories don't get stored in like a linear fashion. They get stored in ways that this is EMDRs. They get stored uh, in the brain in lots of different ways. And when memories are stressed, they actually are this is going to make police officers, they hate this, but they actually are much more fragmented and less organized, the more stressful the environment is. And there are things that we can do. We are learning that they're connected to our senses, just in part of how the limbic system works. Just so where they're located means that a lot of sensory stimulation can work. And then we also know a lot, I mean, most of the research is around prefrontal cortex, last part of the brain to be developed. It's unfortunately where many therapeutic orientations spend a lot of their energy around like talk therapy and developing cognitions. And we now know that if you don't take care of the sort of more, and we're not supposed to use this word anymore, but primitive part of the brain, so more first developed part of the brain, this prefrontal cortex activity, not as good, not as useful. And so, can I do one small thing? So, when I think about healing, so we know that, and we now really think most of right, the prevailing theory around trauma healing is this polyvagal theory, right? And it's really around thinking about the nervous system, changing the nervous system's response. And that exists. So I want to be basic. If I think the brain is built from back to front, that's accepted. That's not fancy science. If we think healing happens back to front,
Mm.
so if I am with you and you feel safe with me, it's why many people say it's the therapeutic relationship and not the therapeutic content that works. So if
Right.
I'm with you and I can co-regulate with you and I can feel you and you can feel empathy and feel safe, if we don't do that, it doesn't matter what fancy technology I use, never going to work, right?
Hmm.
And then if
Hmm.
I think about like offering you things that are good for limbic midbrain sensory supports, right? So knowing that sometimes telling your story to me over and over again can only just re-encode the memory more, right? It doesn't necessarily create more healing just because of how the brain works. And that if we think about things like grounding and movement and kinesthetic and somatic activities, right? Those are all midbrain, how we know where we know memories get stored. And then the last part of the brain is sort of meaning making. Like, so you feel safe with me. We've got some ways to get you in touch with your feelings and your emotions. And then we can re-narrate, you can retell the story, you can make meaning, you can do stuff, you can be aware of cognitive distortion, right? Like you do all the fancy stuff.
Hmm.
But if you don't do the primitives, right, like the
Hmm.
can you be safe with me first? So that's to me why I love trauma work is that it just makes sense with how we're designed.
Hmm.
And it's why like EMDR in the absence of a strong therapeutic relationship, making time that to be sure that you have a container of resources and resilience and support. We could do
Right.
fancy stuff.
Right.
It's never going to work. That's why the results are mixed because
Yeah.
still at the bottom of the, at the end of the day, you've got to feel
It's
safe with,
safety. Yeah. It's
yeah.
interesting. I had a consultation with a supervisor who said to me, your grounding technique is your interpersonal relationship, meaning that your interpersonal skill is what is helping ground your clients more so than container and and breathing and sending them to a calm place. Like you're grounding them with an interpersonal experience, which I thought was so powerful of like that actually makes so much sense. And that blend of the therapeutic relationship as well as using that therapeutic relationship to continue to create safety, really powerful. Can I say something? Do we under when we talk about trauma, I feel like the word has definitely been maybe the word of the century or the word of the generation for sure. I actually, it's funny because I'll say to sometimes with my parenting, I'll be like, no, please don't just say like, oh, that was so traumatic. Like if you're going to use the word traumatic, then use it carefully because it means something. I'm wondering how we experience different kinds of trauma, like in your experience, and maybe talk a little bit about what your most of the audiences that you're working with, or the patient population that you're kind of maybe mostly engaged in. Are we looking primarily at developmental trauma? Are we looking at generational trauma? Right. So that's the thing that I think is so fascinating to me is that we lump the two together in terms of how it impacts the brain, but yet I can grow up in a very safe and protected childhood environment, but yet as a Jewish person, I have this transgenerational experience, and I will not, and I'll ask you permission if you speak to this as a Black woman, right? The transgenerational history is you could have grown up in the most wonderful, safe, and healthy childhood, but the history comes into our experiences. So could we tease that apart a little bit about like
Yeah.
developmental trauma where a parent is unavailable or maybe mentally ill or struggling with health issues or whatever the childhood developmental struggle is, as differentiated from the maybe more epigenetic experience of trauma. Let's tease that apart a little bit.
Okay. So gonna try to do that. Just a reminder, right? We're all a combination of genes and triggers, right? All like that's how we're made, right? Ideally, when mommy genes and daddy genes come together, and or those kind of genetic expressions come together, depending on what happens in the healthiest environment, the yucky stuff gets sloughed off and doesn't get passed on. But our parents are not always children are not always created in the most optimal environments, in the best of environment. You could be super stressed or it could be a bad day. You just never know. And the more those environments are like more um, less optimal, the more yucky genes get passed on, right? Like that's
Okay.
not, I know a scientist would be like, oh my gosh, that's not correct, but it's how I can explain it to people. And when we think about things like so part one, every bad experience isn't a trauma. So we've come to understand traumatic experiences as being those things that overwhelm the nervous system's ability to cope. And it's why when we think the younger you are, the less resources you have, which is why we spend a lot of energy around developmental trauma because you have less resources, like language is a resource, to tell people something bad happened to you or that you have needs. But it can happen, those bad things can happen across the lifespan. And we're always kind of dancing between risk and protective factors. I use this metaphor like a car accident, a regular car accident, air quote, regular car accident, where you have health insurance, a place to live, family support. It could be even a car accident that totals your car. It can be a really yucky car accident, but it may not be traumatic.
Mhm.
A car accident where you are in the hospital and you don't have health insurance and you lose your job. And then when you get out of the hospital, your partner breaks up with you. Yeah, that's going to land, right?
Mhm.
It just is going to feel different. And it looks like the same variables, but risk and protective factors make a difference. So, um, it is why my organization is the Trauma and Resilience. And so we're constantly thinking about buffers and bridges for people. And now, in the best environments, like if my parents, so for example, we'll take anxiety, gene gets passed on. It's hard to not have anxiety and not have a parent who's had anxiety. And some of that anxiety, people will be like, it doesn't make sense. Well, if I grow up in environments, in a world where I am directly and indirectly receiving messages that my being isn't safe, it is a normal, functional, adaptive response to stress to be hypervigilant, to be looking for feelings of unsafety. So it is
Mm.
in the wiring. So my amygdala will fire differently, but then it's also in the reinforcement because even if my parents are like doing good enough parenting, when they are probably around certain things that we're constantly co-regulating and they feel unsafe, it's helping me know, ooh, environment, not good. And it's impossible to live in a world and not get information and messaging that would be anti-Semitic or you would just learn history. And there's no way that you could learn about the Holocaust or the Jewish experience and not realize there's been a lot of bad things that have happened. And so take the genetic amygdala firing, reinforced by social cultural factors.
Mm.
It's the expression of the gene.
So even as a grandchild per se, like say, or
Yeah.
even we're at the point where we maybe even have we definitely have great grandchildren of survivors, then that the way that they were parented, though, I always saw it as like, okay, they were parented by people who maybe did not have their own parents living with them, or their parents were killed, or grandparents. They lived with the stories of their childhood. Their childhood stories were ones of death and fear, rightfully, correct? And then that is how they were parented. But you're saying that actually just the emotional experience of fear or
Yeah,
anxiety, if we want to give it a more clinical term, that fear and anxiety is the way that the body begins to say, I am not safe. I need to be on guard. Even if it's not overtly expressed, you should be worried about your neighbors, right? It's more about like living in an environment that there's this threat because the parent has lived with that threat for their whole lives as well.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
then it gets reinforced,
Yeah.
so, right. And so you are, first of all, looking for danger. I always gonna
Sure.
try to keep it a little bit, but like I always say, like, oh, if you anticipate somebody's cheating and you go through the phone, you're probably gonna find something. Your nervous system's that way. Like it's because your parents want to keep you safe, and if you exist in a world that it sends you messages, your parents fear, maybe their heart rate gets more elevated in certain environments, or they hold your hand a little bit tighter, or you walk into a room and there's a conversation and you feel it, then you just start to scaffold those experiences.
Mm.
And we know from the way that the amygdala fires and wires, we know conservatively that it can be 3 generations, and now they're thinking up to 6 generations based on some of the science. And
But can,
the science is
yeah,
primarily with rat studies, but
sure.
we're
Yeah, I think
starting to
we're living
generalize.
that science, right? Like, but
Yeah.
here's the thing that I'm questioning is like, but how would we actually, if we live in an ongoing threat? So if I'm living with anti-Semitism, which we all know is on the rise, and not just in theory, in practice, right? Is there really a way for me to be protective of that experience to my child because I am actively involved and engaged in conversations around the news or now obviously with being mindful of being, they don't need to know all the details. That absolutely is a responsibility, I think, as a parent to protect our children from that information. But they know there are threats here just as much as I know there's threats here. So when we
Yeah.
talk about, well, up to 3 generations, I'm thinking, yeah, not a chance because nothing's going to change in the way that I'm parenting my child because there's an ongoing threat here, right?
Yeah.
So the reality of anxiety being something that's handed down generationally or passed down or kind of absorbed generationally as a parenting experience, my kids are screwed, right? Like there's just no way around it. Like that's it, it's done, right? So now I move on to the next generation. If they live in increased safety, then they're still living with how they were raised. Man,
Absolutely.
this is
Yeah.
tough, right?
It's
Like there
tough. That's
really
why we're
is.
doing so much
Yeah,
this is why
yeah.
that
Okay.
commitment to creating more healing spaces, this is the trauma informed work, is so
Mm,
important, because I'm not going to treat my way into healing this. Like we're going to have to change how we live with each other, how we live in community, how we understand things that are harmful that we're doing. And so if we're not thinking broader and deeper, we just keep creating more woundedness and more people who have capacity to wound. The last thing that I want to offer is, and we've seen this culturally, it is also why some people have thought that maybe if we don't talk about it at all,
right.
maybe if we deny culture, we deny difference, we try to minimize it, and we create this space of frozenness, that it is safer.
Mm,
And then people then get, lots of ways that people try to appeal to frozenness, where sometimes it's substance, sometimes it's really huge denial, sometimes it's significant depression, sometimes it's a lot of different ways. And some of those can look really on the surface adaptive. Like we deny culture, we pretend like it's not there. We're just people, right? But the way that the brain and body work, it's not sustainable. You
Hmm.
can't be in a frozen state for forever, even if you think it's protective. And then what we've seen with children is that disconnect between what they were told around safety and their lived experience. And then people go to college and then all bets are off
Exactly.
because their
Exactly.
nervous systems, they
Right.
develop no compensatory skills and they're like, this is not what this was not what I was promised.
Yeah. Well,
And
I think
it's
that's
a,
actually, yeah, I think that actually came up, just sorry to interrupt you, but like that has come up a lot where there's been a significant amount of assimilation of the Jewish tradition over the years, where it was almost like we don't need this unique culture. It's more of an ethnic experience. It's more of a cultural experience than an ethnic experience or religious experience. And then there was this a very, very harsh wake up, and like nobody really cared what kind of Jew you were as long as you're a Jew. So
yeah,
I think I
yeah.
speak to that, you speaking to that directly. Where do we move towards if I can't help them? Meaning, if the exposure is there and this is the lived experience that our children are in right now, especially at this moment in 2025, what are there must be you talk about the idea of the difference between the dancing between risk and protective factors.
Yeah.
What are some, as a mother, as a parent, as we parent our children in environments that maybe have high risk? And again, I acknowledge that I'm speaking specific to the Jewish experience, but I really would like to hear some more about other communities of culture and how they're living in experiences, especially of racism, right? And that generational trauma that is an ongoing experience. But what are some of those protective factors, and what is available to me as a parent if I understand that I can't protect my child from trauma, but there must be something that I can do as a parent that offers them some, you use the word compensation or protective factors. What's available?
So, some simple stuff. We'll start with simple and then we'll go complicated. Simple, safe spaces to be and talk. The more I can acknowledge that I'm feeling worried or stressed and that you can validate it and you don't shut it down, the better I can cope. And also learning that many families don't teach this, but learning emotional regulation, like teaching me how to self-soothe. I know, like going back to the womb, but my ability to soothe myself when I am upset, my ability to have coping skills, also to get soothed by you, and we can differentiate when I can do it and when we need to do it together. Language, also creating safe spaces. So, are there places where kids who have similar values, maybe they're kids of culture, or fake parents who kind of are, done, for lack of better, their work. And so the environment is one that is open and inviting and accepting, and that the parents can de-roll and the kids can de-roll and they can kind of come together and be together and have those moments of opportunity. And then we know things like outlets, music, art, sports, play. And again, the more people have reflections of themselves, the more people can validate their being and becoming, right? The better they'll be. And we want to think about communities for the adults in your life because kiddos can be only as good as the parents, which is unfortunate. So you having outlets where you can be seen and heard and validated, where your worries and fears can be normalized, where you have colleagues and peers and friends, all of that matters. And to think about bridges of opportunity. So, are there people, mentors, role models, coaches who can show me different ways, different possibilities? Always, because if I can, if knowing people, I know people, I'm going to go back to the Jewish community. I know had the privilege to work with young adults who've had a chance to go back to Israel, and those have been really like healing and unique experiences for them. So again, because they were times where for the first time in their life, they didn't feel hypervigilant. It's a little bit different now, but they didn't feel as worried. They felt like a sense of belonging. Also, they could do meaning and purpose. There were things that they could do that felt, I mean, even I've known people who even chose to go back for direct service. All of those things
Mhm.
validate and help with the healing of the nervous system. So when they come back here, it's just like they've had a real solid grounding experience,
Mm.
even, across the board.
Fascinating. I mean, it makes sense to me from a communal perspective. I think about the value of congregation, right? The value
Yeah.
of, we send our children to Jewish day schools, and there's a really critical reason to that. It costs a lot of money, and yet it's an environment that is safer.
Yeah.
It was fascinating this morning. Today is the last day of Hanukkah, and I was in an exercise class, and the instructor was like, "We're doing Hanukkah, whatever routine, and it's because of the last day of Hanukkah." And it was like, in an environment where everything is Christmas trees, to be, and especially today, especially
Yeah.
today, she is a Christian woman. She's talking about going to church on Wednesday and Thursday, and yet she was willing to create an environment that I just felt a little seen, and it felt a little silly, but yet also not so silly. It was
Yeah.
and I thanked her. I did. I went over her afterwards, and just saying that means that you recognize that I exist and that I am worthy of existing in this space, in an exercise class. And yet, we need more of those moments where I've had people recently who wish me a happy Hanukkah, and I'm like, how'd you know? I'm like, yeah, I know, of course, it's pretty obvious, but also thank you. Like, thank you
Yeah.
for that acknowledgement. I am so grateful for, especially in these times. So, those small things, but the big one to me is congregation and communities of gathering that allow us to. But I love how you're describing that as actually those are protective, and
Oh, yeah.
those are creating safety and resiliency in the
Yeah.
capacity to manage whatever comes our ways. Um, I do want to take a few minutes though to talk about, well, you said you wanted to do the hard stuff. Is that the easy stuff or was that the hard stuff?
So I think that so I think both hard and easy, but I wanted to just mention just the intentionality. So that's the hard piece.
Okay.
It's the thinking about designing policies, procedures, and practices that allow for those things, right?
Hmm.
So it is, thinking about the structure of the school, like what are the lightings? How do kids go there? My daughter was fortunate. We were in Indianapolis. My daughter's, like many kids of her generation, her first day of kindergarten was at 9/11.
Oh,
Yeah,
hmm.
yeah.
Well,
Actually, second day. So 9/11, and she was at a Hebrew school. So we loved the rabbis, and they'd written these great children's books. So we were like, having a cultural, and what are the odds, right?
wow.
And they spent uh, their first 6 months, because people can be awful, having to have sheriff and police presence. And they first 3 months couldn't go outside because people constantly did bomb threats, which didn't make sense, but bomb threats and then they had to have security. But what I loved was the rabbis constantly talked with us. They just normalized like kiddo expressions. They did as much to make the environment as welcome, like to just minimize the police presence, but also to like make it as inviting and welcoming and playful. And my daughter, and she's still friends with some of the kiddos that she went to school with, they they report feeling safe,
Mm,
right? Like
hmm.
they do.
Hmm.
They were the kiddos did a lot of reenactment of what they had seen on TV. So there was a lot of like bombs and crashes and planes, and they let us know as parents like this is normal. And then they gave us tools as parents to just sort of not get dysregulated when kids were doing normal ways of engaging with play, like working it out.
Right.
And
Right.
so thinking about those, but those are policy decisions. Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
how do you train the teachers? How do you make room for things? How do you make space? How do you make sure that you don't just sort of drive by it? So policies, procedures, and practices. We were given handouts and books, and we were just, but think about that across. the lifespan. So if I'm
Absolutely.
in an elderly care facility, what are the policies, procedures, and practices that help me feel safe and understand that I might have a little bit more hypervigilance, especially if I've had bad experiences in my young childhood and then I'm in this other environment. Just all of the acknowledgement, being seen, those are structural things. So that's what I
Hmm.
think is
Hmm.
harder because I've seen really amazing organizations want to talk trauma all day long and not change the policies, procedures, and practices. And so they end up reinforcing harm, even though it's designed to be good. It's
Right.
just you got to think
Right.
about the rest of it. Like how
Yeah.
you do it matters as much as what you do.
I remember being in a more of an institutional environment where they were doing a whole trauma initiative and there was hours and hours of training on trauma that were fine. And it was all about like, we're going to change policy, we're going to change procedure, and none of it happened. I don't remember any any follow-up. It was
Yeah.
hours and hours of training. And it was like, wait, did we just do this for like a grant? Like, what did we do this for? Was this just about talk or was this about in practice? Because there was something so completely misunderstood about the whole point. It's not only about knowing the knowledge of how trauma experiences happen or trauma impacts our bodies, but like, okay, what do we do to make our families feel experience safety? Without a doubt, without a doubt.
Yeah,
Could we
right.
take
How
a
does that
couple? Yeah,
reception is like, how
yeah,
does that reception, what supports, so the person at the front desk, like,
yeah.
how are they trained? And how do we support them so that the training that you offer feels good? Because they might be grumpy if they've got the phone and they also have to enter and, and they're managing 14 different things and you keep adding more expectations for them and they never get any of the clinical supervision that people in the back get. And then you wonder why, people in the front get dysregulated because they're encountering a front desk person who's dysregulated. But changing that policy,
Hmm.
right,
Hmm. Yeah,
seems small, but for organizations, like to make the investment and to think it through and like, just that's why I
yeah,
think
absolutely.
the rubber never meets the road.
Right, I hear it. Could we take just a couple of minutes? And it's unfair to ask this of you, but could we take a couple of minutes? We focused in on the Jewish community. Can you identify a little bit more communities of color and how racism is seen as a traumatic experience today? I spoke to anti-Semitism. Can you speak to a
Yeah.
moment on racism?
So, so racism typically as it's expressed is really thinking about like policies, procedures, and practices that impact people of color, people. And, I do probably most of my work thinking about structures of inequality. And I think racism is the biggest structure of inequality. And it's why things just get organized where there's a group on top kind of keeping people marginalized on the bottom, m- mostly designed by race. But I think a lot of people can be on the bottom because it can be proximity by class, proximity by gender identity, right? Like there are lots of different ways. So that's the short answer. It is not prejudice. And I always remind people we want to sometimes conflate people who don't like me because I don't want you to not like me, but you cannot like me as a person. And you can have a lot of bigoted and biased ideas about who I am as a Black woman. I don't want it. But then when you take your bigoted, biased ideas and you deny me access to employment, or, we come up with policies, a lot of like the policies around education are based on some really racist ideas, where people don't want to fund public education or public schools because they have ideas about the people who go and what they're worthy of. And right, those are the kinds of policies that have generational impact.
Hmm.
Then I get worried, right? Like, no, I don't want you to not like me. But then when you have structures of power and access, privilege is this funky word, but really what we just mean is the ability to not have to worry about something.
Hmm.
And when you take your ability not to worry about something and a bias and you put it together, you get racism and classism and sexism, and they all work together. You cannot, I tell this to any community that I'm working with, to deny anyone access to their humanity is to deny us all access to our humanity. They all work together. And I think we had moments in the civil rights movement where we realized that, where we were like, ah, and we could have this whole long conversation. I think, um, the Jewish community and the African American community were very
Very
tied together.
aligned.
My
Yeah,
right, yeah,
deeply.
my father was a civil freedom was participated in Freedom Summer, and
Really.
just really aligned. And then I think we were pitted against each other in really intentional ways, because that alliance allowed us to challenge structures of power.
Mm,
And, having us divided against each other allows us to not work in ways that are synergetically to create more change across the time, across
hmm
time. And so it's how we end up here where,
Yeah,
we're once again sort of in our own little fiefdoms, instead of realizing what's happening to immigrants, especially Spanish speaking and Asian and African immigrants, is our story. And what
absolutely.
is the anti-Semitism is our story, and the ongoing expressions of racism are our story. And if we get to the root of it, it is a very similar story.
It
We
really
just don't
is.
want to talk about it,
Yeah,
right?
no, I think it really is. And it always like it makes sense that the Jewish community would have been involved in the civil rights movement. It should have, I always felt like, wait, how did we get to so disconnected years later that we don't see ourselves as more similar than different? And maybe that's my own, blinders as to how my structure of community has shifted or is different than the Black community structure and culture has is different than my as like taken different pathways. It's something. I actually went to Norfolk State University. I went to a historically an HBCU and
Wow.
historically Black college, and I was definitely the minority, and I definitely gained some insight into that, but I also wasn't welcomed into the knowledge of that difference of experience. It wasn't until much later that I began to, first of all, that I even understood what it meant to be at an HBCU, but also to understand like some of the differences in how each community has evolved, and also where both of our communities are deeply struggling and where in theory there could be more synergy, but there isn't. I
Yeah.
do want to speak just for a minute about in maternal health, because that's really where we met, and just talking a little bit about how the trauma of the transgenerational trauma really shows up in our mental health spaces, or how let's say specifically women are experiencing their health care, maybe even just focusing as narrowly as we can into the hospital system. There were some pretty horrific videos that have been released recently of women who are really about to give birth, like clearly almost crowning, and were denied care. I cannot look at that video without saying, like, how could anybody look at that video and think that this is acceptable behavior? And knowing that race played into that dynamic without a
Mhm.
question. Um, and I just wonder if you want to speak a couple minutes to that experience of women and their interaction and interfacing with the medical mental health world, and how that's like intertwined with the trauma experience.
Oof.
I know, right? In 30 seconds
Right.
or
In
less,
30
please give us.
seconds. So yes, it's hard to, as you said, it's hard to think of a place to even to locate it in the hospital setting feels inappropriate, because we know from the first maternal health visit that there are biases around like who should be able to, I mean, right? Like who
Yeah.
should be able to have it, where you go, what's that environment? Are you believed? How do people experience what options you get, particularly now, like what options you get. So from the beginning, that whole experience can be skewed. And if you, depending on what your insurance are, if you have public insurance or private insurance, also can, what testing options, what conversations, what, uh, you know, just, I can
What
use a
assumptions?
specific, what
What
assumptions
assumptions are
people
made?
are
Hmm
made from the beginning.
Yeah.
And then if you are using maybe more of the public health, public side of maternal health, many, many options. I think that that was one of the things that you and I talked about. Many, many options just aren't afforded to you.
Yeah.
Um, and and because it's assumed, one, that there's not a payer source for it, and that if you were going to choose it, maybe you and your family wouldn't be able to afford the care or so lots of assumptions get made for you, lots of assumptions get made about you, about your ability to care. And then, you take the whole pregnancy journey, and there's just from every visit. So if you lose, if there's a miscarriage or a loss earlier in pregnancy, do people respond to that in ways that are empathetic or acknowledgement? Or is it sort of like, oh, don't worry about it, you're gonna have another baby tomorrow? Like, right? Implicit bias, like you'll just pop them out. Implicit bias from the beginning. And then again, we'll take the whole pregnancy journey, just
Yeah.
complicated. So by the
Yeah.
time you make it to the hospital,
Yeah.
is your pain acknowledged? Again, who's the payer source is going to change your experience. It's going to also change who's providing care. So, yes, you can see those videos, and you can also know that maybe in a more public health hospital, those nurses might have been working more shifts than they should. They could be incredibly under-resourced. Many will tell you they're at burnout or near burnout. So there is a lack of heartfelt connection to the
Sure.
work that they do. And then,
And
and so
also,
then we think
mhm.
about intergenerational trauma. If I won't talk about this from a mental health, not from a maternal health side, I will use a personal example. So I had been struggling with kidney disease for a while. 4 years ago, they put that I had a stage 4 kidney failure in my file. No one had ever had a conversation with me about it. So, I was like, somebody either needs to talk to me about it or remove this diagnosis. But I've been sort of seeing nephrologists and urologists back and forth. And so I'm seeing my nephrologist recently, and I'm saying to him, for 5 years, you guys have been trying to figure out what's going on. And recently you were just like, we'll just sort of watch and see. And I was like, you can't tell me that I have perhaps either stage 3 or stage 4 kidney disease, and we'll be watching and seeing. And so I just kept getting it more and more escalated. And so I said to him, my grandmother died of kidney failure. And I didn't go into the story, but she died of kidney failure, and they could have treated her, and they didn't because they didn't assume my family could afford the care.
Yeah.
And so when I'm sitting with him, and he is talking about the medications I'm on, and he's like, that helps with anxiety. We could remove it, but you may need it for anxiety. And I said, I'm not just generally anxious. Like, I keep telling you, I have a grandma and he's like, oh yeah, you've told me that before. And I was like, because I keep telling you, because I want you to hear like how serious this is for me, and how when I'm sitting here and you're talking about my kidneys failing, I can't help but feel a little dysregulated, even though while I'm waiting for you, I'm breathing and I'm staying calm and I'm not raising my voice and I'm trying to respond with as much, compassion. Again, I'm doing all the work. And so imagine at
Hmm.
labor and delivery, where maybe my mom had a negative experience or her grandma had a negative experience. And then I'm coming in trying to do the best I can to have the bestest experience. And people may be rude or not friendly or dismiss my pain. And then I've got like all of history coming with me into the delivery room. And I can try to stay well regulated, but this isn't like prefrontal cortex. Like, this is
It's
like my
it's in the
nervous
base of
system
your
is
brain.
telling
Right.
you. And
Right.
imagine
Right.
in delivery, where I definitely, people are like, oh, trust your body and in your rhythm. And you're contracting because your nervous system says the environment isn't safe, because it isn't safe. So I was using
Right.
my
Ooh.
kidney example
Right.
because it was a really recent experience. And he,
I have to respond because like my body is reacting to that kidney story, the kidney experience, the nephrology experience, because what I'm hearing is like, geez, the patient has to like reassure the doctor that she's not just generally anxious, but she actually has reason to be anxious. And like, could you please pay attention to my anxiety? Really? Like we're in a system where a physician is that the patient and the physician will have a totally different experience to this story, but that the patient feels that they need to validate their fear or validate their worry or like substantiate it with history versus just being like, I have a concern here and I have a grandmother that died of kidney. What's the connection? Right? Or where is their family? What is how relevant is this family history? Or yeah, this worries me versus the need to like authenticate the right to have the feelings. And I think that I've heard that thread. I know I've heard that thread before in the maternal health and the birthing experiences of like, I have the right to be worried about dying because Black maternal mortality is higher in this country than anywhere else, right? And that Black
And
women die at a much higher rate than white women. And so, and even with that, you're going to come into that hospital room and you're going to try to be on your best behavior because you don't want anybody to call you out as being like, so she's super anxious or she's like highly activated or like, oh, her nervous system is dysregulated, right? Like, why is that even something that
yeah,
you would have to be worried about? And yet you
yeah,
are. And that to me is exactly how that trauma continues to show up. Like that's what you're talking about how that trauma shows up. You can come from the safest, healthiest, most amazing childhood, and yet when we are in an environment, like you said, when we do not feel safe, our body is like, here it is, right here on a platter, and you have to work so hard to find safety again. And
yeah,
yeah, there's so
yeah,
much to talk about in that
yeah.
space. But in the last couple minutes, we have one or two misconceptions about trauma that if you're willing to share.
Yes. So every bad experience is not traumatic. Every bad experience is not traumatic. And healing is possible. It is not a bad thing that happens to you, even if it's traumatic, does not have to all be negative. I know it's buzzy, but there's a lot of conversation around post-traumatic growth. And I do believe that, like many beautiful paintings and pictures, the complexities of our lived experience actually can make it richer and more beautiful. So trauma gets sort of lumped into this like negative bucket, but there's probably no one's autobiography that you've read that doesn't have some complexity. Um, there's a phrase, right? To whom much is given, as much as required. But in some ways, when life gives complexity, it can really become a resource. Most of our healers and helpers statistically have had some traumatic experiences in their lives, and it's what drives the work. So those are the two, and
I
and
love
I
that.
just can't stress enough that healing is possible, healing is possible. And then the last one, which is something that we're just learning, in human services, we talk a lot about person first language, and you are not what happened to you, so people, and the more you tell a story in a certain way, the more
Mhm.
you become that story, and at any given time you can change your narrative.
I think that's so powerful because I think that sometimes people work so hard to claim this trauma narrative because it was so invalidated in childhood or as they've grown up, but then they get stuck in that narrative.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think I really appreciate that you were like, you don't have to be, and that it
yeah.
isn't dismissive if someone talks to you about like, well, what next? Like where do we go with this? And where do we how do we adjust the narrative or reshape it or claim it differently? And then I do think that is the work of good therapy for sure. Um,
Yes, 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 yes,
this
yes.
has been a treat. Will put your information in the bio. If people want to read more about the trauma project that you have, the Trauma and Resiliency Initiative. I do feel like there's was definitely more that we could have covered, but we ran out of time. But thank
Mm.
you for just showing up so authentically and fully. And I hope that you are in good health and continue to be in good health, and that this holiday season is wonderful for you as it was for me. So
Thank you so much, and happy Hanukkah.
thank you.